Detective Billy Mackenzie stopped mid-step, his weathered hand frozen on Ranger's leash as the German Shepherd's ears snapped forward like radar dishes locking onto a signal. The familiar bustle of Tulsa International Airport's baggage claim suddenly felt suffocating, every sound amplified as Ranger's low growl rumbled through his chest, a sound Billy had never heard in their 5 years together. It wasn't the usual alert behavior for drugs or explosives. This was primal terror. Airport Security Supervisor Janet Mills dropped her clipboard, the metal clattering against the polished floor as Ranger erupted into frantic barking at a black suitcase circling endlessly on Carousel 3. Passengers scattered, mothers clutching children, but Billy couldn't look away from his partner's wild eyes. The same haunted look Ranger had carried from whatever hell he'd endured before they found each other. "Override the protocol," Billy commanded, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Open it now." What kind of evil could break a war dog's spirit, and why was it sitting unclaimed in the heart of America? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Detective Billy Mackenzie had seen enough broken things in his 58 years to recognize the signs. The tremor in his hands that started after Fallujah never quite went away, especially on mornings like this when the Oklahoma sky hung heavy with the promise of storms. He'd been working airport security for 3 years now, ever since the Tulsa Police Department suggested he might benefit from a quieter assignment after the incident with the domestic violence call that went sideways. The truth was simpler and more painful. Billy Mackenzie was a man learning how to live again, one day at a time, with a German shepherd who understood trauma better than most therapists. Ranger had been a military working dog, though his file remained largely classified. What Billy knew for certain was that the 8-year-old shepherd had been retired from service under circumstances involving experimental protocols that left him with an uncanny ability to detect things other dogs missed. More importantly, Ranger had pulled Billy back from the edge 5 years ago during the worst panic attack of his life, when the nightmares about his best friend James Miller's death in Iraq had finally overwhelmed his ability to cope. They'd found each other at the Veterans Affairs office on a Tuesday morning when Billy was seriously considering whether his service pistol might solve more problems than it created. Ranger had simply walked over, placed his massive head on Billy's lap, and stayed there until the shaking stopped. The dog had been waiting for adoption for 18 months. Too damaged for most families, too unpredictable for standard police work, but perfect for a broken detective who understood that some wounds never fully heal. Their apartment on the south side of Tulsa was modest. 2 bedrooms, one for Billy and one that served as Ranger's domain, complete with orthopedic bedding and a collection of toys the dog never played with but seemed to need nearby. The walls held Billy's Army commendations alongside Ranger's service ribbons, 2 soldiers who'd found peace in routine and mutual dependence. Billy's ex-wife Linda used to say he loved that dog more than he'd ever loved her, and maybe she wasn't wrong. Ranger didn't judge the nights when Billy woke up screaming, didn't complain about the careful rituals that kept anxiety at bay, didn't ask questions about why Billy's children stopped calling after the divorce. The dog simply existed in the present moment, alert and steady, a 4-legged anchor in a world that often felt like it was spinning too fast. Their morning routine was sacred: coffee for Billy, premium kibble for Ranger, a brief walk around the neighborhood where other early risers had learned to nod respectfully at the pair. Then the drive to the airport, where Billy's badge and Ranger's nose made them a formidable team in the endless war against people who use shadows and hidden compartments to move things that shouldn't be moved. But this morning felt different. Ranger had been restless during their walk, pausing to sniff the air with an intensity that made Billy's survival instincts twitch. Something was coming, and both of them could sense it. The black suitcase had been circling Carousel 3 for 18 hours, and that alone should have triggered protocols. Billy approached it with the methodical caution of a man who'd learned the hard way that assumptions could kill you. Ranger's behavior had escalated from unusual to unprecedented. The dog was now pawing at the luggage with desperate intensity, whining in a pitch Billy had never heard before. "Sir, we really should wait for the bomb squad," Airport Security Supervisor Janet Mills said, her voice tight with regulation and fear. She was a good woman, former Air Force herself, but she'd never seen combat and didn't understand that sometimes waiting meant watching people die. Billy knelt beside the suitcase, his trained eyes cataloging details. No external wires, no unusual weight distribution, but there were tiny holes along the seam, deliberately drilled, not manufacturing defects. Ranger's nose pressed against these holes, his entire body trembling with an urgency that bypassed every protocol Billy had ever learned. "Something's alive in there," Billy said quietly, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "Janet, we need to open this now." The first latch clicked open with a sound that seemed to echo through the suddenly quiet baggage claim area. The second latch followed, and then Billy lifted the lid with the same careful precision he'd once used to examine roadside bombs in Anbar province. The smell hit him first: urine, feces, and something wild and musky that spoke of fear and suffering. But it was the sight that broke something inside his chest that had been carefully held together with scar tissue and stubborn will. 3 tiger cubs lay nestled in soiled straw, their orange and black striped bodies barely moving. Their eyes were closed, their breathing shallow and rapid. The largest, a female with distinctive markings around her eyes, managed to lift her head slightly when the light hit her. The middle cub, a male, stirred weakly but couldn't seem to focus. The smallest one, Billy could see it was another male, lay motionless except for the faint rise and fall of his tiny rib cage. "Jesus Christ," Janet whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. "How long have they been in there?" Billy's military training kicked in, overriding the emotional tsunami threatening to drown him. "Janet, call Dr. Mary Beth Davidson at the Animal Emergency Center. Tell her we're coming in hot with 3 critically dehydrated tiger cubs. Then call FBI agent Rebecca Sullivan. This is federal wildlife trafficking now." He carefully lifted the smallest cub, feeling the fragile bones beneath fur that should have been thick and lustrous, but was instead matted and dull. The tiny creature barely weighed 3 pounds, and Billy could count every rib. In that moment, holding this dying baby tiger, he was transported back to Iraq, to the day he'd held James Miller while his best friend bled out from an IED blast, whispering promises he couldn't keep about getting home to see his newborn daughter. "Not again," Billy whispered to the unconscious cub. "Not on my watch." Ranger pressed close, his nose gently touching the cub Billy held. The dog's agitation had transformed into something else, a protective alertness that Billy recognized from their first meeting at the VA office. This was Ranger's rescue mode, the same instinct that had pulled Billy back from the edge. Janet was already on her radio, her voice professional despite the tremor Billy could detect. "All units, we have a federal wildlife crime in progress. Need immediate veterinary response and FBI notification." Billy carefully gathered the other 2 cubs, their small bodies warm but far too light. The female cub's eyes fluttered open for a moment, revealing startling blue irises that would eventually turn amber if she lived long enough. Something in those eyes reminded him of his own granddaughter, the one he'd never met because his son couldn't forgive him for the drinking years, for the angry words said in the dark months after coming home from war. "We're going to call you Honor," he said softly to the female cub. "And your courage," he told the middle male. The smallest one, still unconscious in his arms, would be Spirit, because if anything deserved that name, it was a creature fighting this hard to stay alive against impossible odds. The hidden compartment in the suitcase revealed more horrors: an encrypted cell phone, photographs of other animals in cages, and a leather portfolio containing what appeared to be shipping manifests. Billy caught a glimpse of letterhead that made his blood run cold: Whitfield Conservation Foundation, a name he recognized from local newspaper articles about wildlife preservation efforts. As they rushed toward the exit, Janet coordinating with airport security to clear their path, Billy made a promise to the 3 tiny lives in his arms. He'd failed to save James Miller, failed to save his marriage, failed to be the father his children needed. But these cubs, honor, courage, and spirit, they were getting every chance he could give them, even if it meant spending his retirement savings and calling in every favor he'd earned in 30 years of service. Dr. Mary Beth Davidson was suturing a barn cat's leg when her emergency line rang at 8:47 a.m. After 12 years of running the Tulsa Animal Emergency Center, she'd learned to read urgency in voices, but Detective Mackenzie's call sent ice through her veins. 3 tiger cubs, critical condition, dehydrated and malnourished. We're 10 minutes out. Mary Beth had lost her husband Tom in a car accident 12 years ago, hit by a drunk driver who walked away without a scratch while Tom died instantly. She'd thrown herself into veterinary work afterward, specializing in exotic animals because regular house pets reminded her too much of the golden retriever they'd planned to get once they started their family. Now, at 52, her clinic had become her church, and saving animals had become her form of prayer. She cleared Surgery Suite A and began preparing IV fluids, warming blankets, and emergency medications. When the clinic door burst open and she saw Detective Mackenzie carrying the 3 cubs, her professional composure nearly cracked. She'd seen wildlife trafficking cases before, but never cubs this young, never anything this heartbreaking. "Surgery table now," she commanded, her voice steady despite the rage building in her chest. The smallest cub, Spirit, Mackenzie had called him, was barely breathing. His gums were pale, his tiny body cold to the touch. She'd seen newborn foals in better condition. "How old are they?" Mackenzie asked as she began her examination. 8 to 10 weeks, far too young to be separated from their mother. Mary Beth's hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking vitals, starting IV lines in veins barely visible through dehydrated skin. "This little one needs surgery immediately. Internal bleeding, possible organ damage from prolonged dehydration. The surgery would cost $12,000 minimum, and that was just for Spirit. Honor and Courage would need thousands more in intensive care." Mackenzie didn't hesitate. "Do whatever it takes. I'll cover it." Mary Beth looked up sharply. She knew detective salaries, knew Mackenzie was probably looking at his entire retirement savings. "Detective, that's my money, my choice," he said quietly, his weathered hands gentle as he stroked Honor's head. "I've got nobody else to spend it on anyway." That's when FBI agent Rebecca Sullivan arrived, her badge identifying her as Wildlife Trafficking Task Force. She was younger than Mary Beth expected, maybe 35, with the kind of controlled intensity that spoke of personal investment in her work. "Dr. Davidson, I need to know, can these cubs be moved to a federal facility?" "Absolutely not." Mary Beth's response was immediate and non-negotiable. "Spirit needs surgery in the next hour, or he dies. The other 2 need at least 72 hours of intensive care before they can be safely transported anywhere." Agent Sullivan nodded grimly. "Then we secure this location. Doctor, I need you to understand, this isn't random. These cubs are part of an international trafficking network we've been tracking for 6 months. The Suitcase, the route through Bangkok and Dubai, it's all deliberate." She pulled out a tablet showing financial records. "The money trail leads to several conservation foundations, including one right here in Tulsa, the Whitfield Conservation Foundation." Mary Beth's hands stilled on Honor's IV line. "Eleanor Whitfield? But she's donated thousands to wildlife preservation. She funds our emergency animal ambulance service." "Which would make her operation the perfect cover," Sullivan said. "Mrs. Whitfield has been flagged for unusual financial activity. Large cash transactions, international wire transfers that don't match her stated income. Mackenzie's jaw tightened. You're telling me some rich old lady is behind this? I'm telling you the evidence points in that direction. We need to— The clinic door chimed and Eleanor Whitfield herself walked in. At 65, Eleanor still carried herself with the grace of someone born to old money, though Mary Beth had always sensed a deep sadness beneath her polished exterior. Her silver hair was perfectly styled despite the early hour, and she wore the kind of understated jewelry that whispered rather than shouted wealth. Dr. Davidson, I came as soon as I heard on the police scanner. Tiger cubs? Here in Tulsa? Eleanor's voice carried exactly the right note of concerned surprise, but Mary Beth noticed her eyes immediately seeking out the cubs on the examination tables. Agent Sullivan's hand moved subtly toward her weapon. Mrs. Whitfield. What an interesting coincidence. Eleanor's gaze sharpened as she took in Sullivan's badge and stance. Agent Sullivan, isn't it? I've heard about your investigation. Tell me, have you found any actual evidence linking me to wildlife trafficking, or are you simply investigating every conservationist in the state? The tension in the room ratcheted up several degrees. Mackenzie stepped protectively closer to the examination table where Spirit lay unconscious, while Ranger positioned himself between Eleanor and the cubs, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Ranger doesn't usually react that way to innocent people, Mackenzie observed quietly. Eleanor's composure flickered for just a moment. Animals can sense many things, Detective. Sometimes fear, sometimes guilt, sometimes just the scent of other animals. She moved closer to the examination table, and Mary Beth was struck by the genuine emotion in her eyes as she looked at Spirit's tiny form. My God, they're so young. What kind of monster would do this to babies? It was either a masterful performance or genuine horror. Mary Beth had spent enough years reading people to know the difference, and Eleanor's reaction seemed authentic. But then again, the best criminals often were the most convincing actors. Mrs. Whitfield, Agent Sullivan said carefully, we'd like you to come in for questioning regarding your foundation's recent financial activities. Eleanor straightened, and for a moment the vulnerable woman vanished, replaced by someone who'd clearly dealt with authority before. Agent Sullivan, unless you're arresting me, I believe I'll stay here and see if I can help these cubs. After all, my foundation exists specifically to prevent this kind of cruelty. She turned to Mary Beth. Doctor, whatever these babies need, surgery, medications, ongoing care, my foundation will cover all expenses, no questions asked. The offer hung in the air like a challenge. Mackenzie's offer had been personal, from his own pocket driven by conscience. Eleanor's was institutional, unlimited, and potentially tainted with blood money. Mary Beth looked at Spirit's tiny form, fighting for every breath, and made the hardest decision of her veterinary career. Both offers accepted. Detective Mackenzie's money for Spirit's surgery, Mrs. Whitfield's foundation for everything else. Right now, these cubs need all the help they can get, regardless of where it comes from. Agent Sullivan's expression suggested she thought Mary Beth was making a terrible mistake. But as Spirit's heart monitor showed a slight improvement in rhythm, Mary Beth knew she'd made the only choice that mattered. The cubs would live. Everything else could be sorted out later. The surgery on Spirit lasted 4 grueling hours. Mary Beth worked with the focused intensity of someone performing a miracle, her hands steady despite the emotional weight of operating on a creature that weighed less than a house cat but carried the genetic legacy of one of the world's most magnificent predators. Detective Mackenzie never left the observation window, watching every suture, every careful manipulation of organs barely larger than his thumb. Eleanor Whitfield remained in the waiting area, her composure gradually cracking as the hours passed. Agent Sullivan watched her with the patience of a predator, noting every fidget, every glance toward the surgery suite, every whispered phone call that Eleanor thought was private. The dynamic between them crackled with unspoken accusations and carefully controlled hostility. When Mary Beth finally emerged from surgery, exhaustion etched in every line of her face, the room held its collective breath. "He made it through," she announced, stripping off her surgical gloves. "Internal bleeding was worse than I thought, and there was some liver damage from toxins. But he's stable. The next 24 hours will tell us if he's going to fully recover." Mackenzie's knees actually buckled with relief. Ranger, who had stationed himself by the surgery door for the entire operation, whined softly and wagged his tail for the first time since they'd found the cubs. Eleanor stood slowly, her hand pressed to her chest. "Thank God. Doctor, is there anything else he needs? Specialized equipment, medications, anything at all?" "Rest, mostly, and prayer, if you're inclined." Mary Beth studied Eleanor's face, seeing genuine relief mixed with something else. Guilt, maybe, or fear. "Mrs. Whitfield, I have to ask. In all your conservation work, have you ever encountered trafficking operations this sophisticated?" Eleanor's pause was barely perceptible, but Agent Sullivan caught it. "Mrs. Whitfield has been involved in wildlife conservation for over 20 years, Sullivan said dryly. "I'm sure she's seen all kinds of operations." "Not like this," Eleanor said quietly. "This level of cruelty, this systematic approach to treating living creatures like merchandise. It's the work of someone with no soul." That afternoon, while Spirit remained under observation and Honor and Courage showed encouraging signs of improvement, the investigation took several disturbing turns. Agent Sullivan's forensics team had traced the encrypted phone found in the suitcase, revealing a network of contacts spanning 3 continents. The photographs discovered with the cubs showed dozens of other animals, snow leopards, pangolins, rare birds, all clearly being held in captivity. More troubling were the images that showed human faces in the background of some photos. Children, ranging in age from perhaps 6 to 14, visible in several shots of what appeared to be holding facilities. "This isn't just wildlife trafficking," Sullivan explained to Mackenzie and Mary Beth in the clinic's office. "We're looking at a full-scale operation that includes human trafficking. The animals might just be one revenue stream." Mackenzie's military training had exposed him to the worst of human nature, but the idea of children being bought and sold alongside endangered animals triggered something primitive and protective in his chest. "How does this connect to Eleanor Whitfield?" Sullivan pulled up financial records on her laptop. 3 months ago, the Whitfield Conservation Foundation received a $2 million anonymous donation. The money was immediately transferred to a shell company in Dubai, then dispersed to accounts linked to known trafficking operations. "That doesn't prove she knew," Mary Beth interjected, though her voice lacked conviction. "No, but this might." Sullivan showed them security footage from the Foundation's offices. "This is from 2 weeks ago. Mrs. Whitfield meeting with a man we've identified as Chen Wei, a facilitator for international wildlife smuggling. They spoke for over an hour." The footage was grainy but clear enough to show Eleanor's distressed body language during the meeting. She appeared to be arguing with Chen, her hands gesticulating emphatically, her face flushed with what looked like anger or fear. Mackenzie studied the screen. "She doesn't look like someone making a business deal. She looks like someone being pressured." "Or someone being given orders she doesn't like," Sullivan countered. Their debate was interrupted by Mary Beth's assistant rushing into the office. "Doctor, you need to come quickly. Mrs. Whitfield is in the recovery room with the cubs and well, you need to see this." They hurried to the recovery area, expecting to find Eleanor doing something suspicious. Instead, they found her sitting beside Spirit's incubator, tears streaming down her face as she hummed a lullaby. Her perfectly manicured hands were pressed against the glass, and she was speaking softly to the unconscious cub. "I'm so sorry, little one. This isn't what your mama wanted for you." This isn't what anyone wanted." Her voice broke on the words. "But you're safe now. I promise you're safe." Honor and Courage, in their adjacent enclosures, had moved as close to Eleanor as possible. Honor was actually pressing her tiny paw against the glass where Eleanor's hand rested, as if seeking comfort from the older woman. Mackenzie felt his certainty about Eleanor's guilt waver. Ranger, typically suspicious of everyone except Mackenzie and Mary Beth, approached Eleanor without his usual wariness. The dog sniffed her shoes, then sat beside her chair, not alerting to danger but offering the same quiet comfort he'd given Mackenzie during his darkest moments. "Mrs. Whitfield," Agent Sullivan said carefully, "we need to talk." Eleanor wiped her eyes but didn't turn away from the cubs. "I know you do, and I suppose it's time I told the truth." She stood slowly, her composure returning like armor being donned for battle. "But not here. These babies have been through enough trauma without hearing about the ugliness that brought them here." They moved to Mary Beth's office, where Eleanor settled into a chair with the grace of someone preparing for confession. Agent Sullivan activated a recording device, but Eleanor waved it away. "That won't be necessary. Everything I'm about to tell you, I've already documented in my safety deposit box. The key is in my purse, and you're welcome to retrieve everything once we're finished here." She took a deep breath, and when she began speaking, her voice carried the weight of months of carried secrets. "My son, William Jr., has been using my foundation as a front for money laundering. I discovered this 6 months ago when I found discrepancies in our accounts. When I confronted him, he explained that he'd become involved with what he called international wildlife acquisition for wealthy private collectors." Eleanor's hands trembled as she continued. "I thought he meant legitimate purchases for accredited zoos and sanctuaries. I was naive. It wasn't until I saw photographs on his computer that I understood the scope of what he was really doing." The photographs she described matched what they'd found in the suitcase: caged animals, holding facilities, and the faces of children who had no business being in such places. "I threatened to expose him, to shut down the foundation and report everything to the authorities. That's when he showed me surveillance footage of my house, my daily routines, and informed me that accidents happen to elderly women who don't mind their own business." Mackenzie's jaw tightened. "He threatened to kill you." Not in so many words, but the implication was clear. "He also reminded me that his father, my late husband, had died in what was ruled an accidental fall down our basement stairs. William Jr. suggested that the police investigation might have missed certain details." Agent Sullivan leaned forward. "You believe your son killed your husband?" "I know he did." Eleanor's voice was steady now, carrying the conviction of someone who'd lived with terrible knowledge for too long. "William Sr. discovered the money laundering before I did. He'd been gathering evidence, planning to go to the FBI. The night he died, he'd told me he was finally ready to turn in our son." The room fell silent except for the gentle hum of medical equipment from the recovery area. Outside, an ambulance siren wailed in the distance, but inside Mary Beth's office, 3 people sat with the weight of understanding that they were dealing with something far more dangerous than simple wildlife trafficking. Eleanor reached into her purse and withdrew a small key. "Box 247 at First National Bank. Everything is there. Financial records, photographs, recordings of conversations with William Jr., even the surveillance footage he showed me of his father's death." She looked directly at Agent Sullivan. "I've been gathering evidence for 6 months, trying to build a case strong enough to ensure he goes to prison for life. But I'm 65 years old, Agent Sullivan. I don't have the resources or the protection to fight my own son indefinitely." Mackenzie understood then why Ranger had eventually warmed to Eleanor. The dog's ability to sense threat versus victim was more refined than any human's, and Ranger had recognized something in Eleanor that the humans had missed. She wasn't the predator in this situation. She was the prey. "Mrs. Whitfield," Mary Beth said gently, Why didn't you go to the police sooner? Eleanor's smile was bitter. Because my son is a respected businessman with connections throughout the state. Because he's been very careful to keep his hands clean while using intermediaries for the actual crimes, and because until these cubs showed up, I didn't have proof that anyone was being actively harmed. She gestured toward the recovery area. Those babies are the first direct evidence of animal cruelty I've been able to connect to his operation. Before this, it was all financial crimes and suspicious associations. Agent Sullivan was already reaching for her phone. We need to bring William Jr. in for questioning immediately. No, Eleanor said firmly. If you arrest him now with just my testimony and financial records, his lawyers will have him out on bail within hours. Then he'll disappear, and you'll never catch the rest of his network. She stood, moving to the window that overlooked the recovery area where the 3 cubs were sleeping peacefully for the first time in weeks. But I have a better idea. One that will get you everything you need to destroy his entire operation. Eleanor's plan was both elegant and terrifying in its simplicity. She would contact William Jr. and inform him that the cubs had been discovered but were being held at a secure, private facility pending transfer to international buyers. The story would be that corrupt airport security had intercepted the shipment but were willing to negotiate a release for the right price. He'll want to move them immediately, Eleanor explained as they huddled around Mary Beth's desk, speaking in whispers despite the clinic's isolation. William Jr. doesn't trust anyone, especially when money is involved. He'll insist on handling the transfer personally to ensure the cubs reach their destination. Agent Sullivan's expression was skeptical. And you think he'll just walk into our trap? I think his greed will override his caution, Eleanor replied. These cubs are worth nearly $500,000 to the right collector. He won't abandon that kind of profit without a fight. Mackenzie studied Eleanor's face, seeing something that reminded him of soldiers preparing for a final mission. A combination of determination and resignation that spoke of someone who'd accepted they might not survive what came next. Mrs. Whitfield, this plan puts you directly in harm's way. If your son suspects you're working with law enforcement, then I'll face the same fate my husband did, Eleanor finished quietly. Detective, I'm 65 years old. I've lived with the knowledge that my only child is a monster for 6 months. I've watched him use my late husband's foundation to fund unspeakable cruelty. If these cubs can help bring him down, then my life will have meant something. Mary Beth's voice was gentle but firm. Eleanor, there has to be another way. We can't ask you to— You're not asking. I'm volunteering. Eleanor's spine straightened with aristocratic resolve. Besides, you need me. William Jr. Won't trust anyone else with a transaction this valuable. It has to be family. The plan they developed over the next several hours was intricate and dangerous. Eleanor would contact William Jr. and arrange a meeting at an abandoned oil refinery 30 miles outside Tulsa, a location Agent Sullivan's team had identified as a suspected storage facility for the trafficking operation. The cubs would be transported in a specially designed vehicle that would allow FBI surveillance while maintaining the illusion of a legitimate transfer. Mackenzie's role would be crucial. His experience with tactical operations and Ranger's unique abilities made them the ideal advance team to scout the location and provide early warning of any complications. The challenge was ensuring Eleanor's safety while gathering enough evidence to dismantle the entire network. As evening approached, Spirit showed remarkable improvement. The tiny cub's eyes opened for the first time since surgery, revealing those startling blue irises that would eventually turn amber. When Mary Beth offered him a syringe of specialized formula, he managed to drink nearly an ounce, a significant victory for a creature who'd been fighting for his life 12 hours earlier. Honor and Courage were also responding well to treatment. Their coats were beginning to show the lustrous quality they should have had, and both cubs were showing curiosity about their surroundings. Honor, in particular, seemed drawn to human voices, perking up whenever someone spoke softly near her enclosure. Eleanor spent the evening beside their recovery area, and Mackenzie was struck by the transformation in her demeanor. The polished socialite facade had given way to something more authentic, a woman finding purpose in protecting the innocent, regardless of the personal cost. "I never had grandchildren," Eleanor said quietly as Mackenzie joined her vigil. "William Jr. was always too busy building his empire to think about family. These little ones, they're the closest I'll ever come to nurturing something pure." Mackenzie understood that feeling. His own children had grown up during his drinking years, when PTSD and alcohol had made him unreliable at best, dangerous at worst. His daughter Sarah had reached out tentatively a few months ago, mentioning that she was pregnant and wondering if he might want to be involved in his grandchild's life. He'd been too afraid of his own capacity for disappointment to respond. "Mrs. Whitfield, when this is over, what will you do? Where will you go?" Eleanor's smile was sad but peaceful. "I don't know that I'll have those choices to make, Detective. My son has made it clear that my continued existence depends on my cooperation. Once I betray him, we'll protect you," Mackenzie said firmly. "Whatever happens tomorrow, you won't face the consequences alone." "That's kind of you to say." Eleanor reached through the enclosure bars to gently stroke Spirit's head. "But we both know how these things usually end. The good people try their best, but the monsters often have more resources and fewer scruples." Ranger, who had been lying quietly beside Mackenzie's chair, suddenly lifted his head and moved to the clinic's front window. His ears perked forward, and a low growl rumbled in his throat. Not the panicked alarm from that morning, but the controlled warning of a guard dog detecting potential threat. Mackenzie joined Ranger at the window, peering into the parking lot where streetlights cast long shadows between the vehicles. For a moment, everything appeared normal. Then he caught a glimpse of movement near the far edge of the lot, a figure in dark clothing who seemed to be observing the clinic. "Agent Sullivan," Mackenzie called quietly. "We've got company." Sullivan was at the window in seconds, her hand instinctively moving to her weapon. The figure had vanished, but Ranger's continued alertness suggested the threat remained nearby. "Could be nothing," Sullivan said, but her tone suggested she didn't believe it. "Or your son might have people watching the clinic, Mrs. Whitfield." Eleanor's face went pale. "If William Jr. suspects I'm involved with the investigation, he'll move against me tonight. And if he realizes the Cubs are here—" She didn't need to finish the thought. Everyone in the room understood that William Jr. couldn't afford to leave witnesses, especially witnesses who could identify his voice, his appearance, or his methods. Mackenzie made a command decision. "We move the operation up tonight." "Detective, we're not ready," Sullivan protested. "The surveillance equipment isn't in place, backup teams aren't positioned, and Mrs. Whitfield might not survive until morning if we wait," Mackenzie interrupted. "Sometimes you have to choose between the perfect plan and the only plan that might work." Mary Beth looked between the Cubs in the window, her maternal instincts warring with her practical judgment. "These babies aren't stable enough for transport. Spirit just came out of surgery, and the stress of moving them could kill them," Eleanor finished. "But leaving them here definitely will kill them if William Jr. decides to eliminate evidence." The decision ultimately came down to trust. Trust in Mackenzie's tactical experience, trust in Sullivan's ability to improvise federal support, and trust in Eleanor's knowledge of her son's psychology. Within an hour, they had developed a modified plan that prioritized immediate safety over optimal evidence gathering. The Cubs would be moved to a secure veterinary facility 40 miles south of Tulsa, where Mary Beth's colleague, Dr. James Patterson, had agreed to provide overnight care. Eleanor would contact William Jr. from there, arranging the meeting for the following afternoon at the oil refinery. Mackenzie and Ranger would conduct advance reconnaissance, while Sullivan coordinated with federal tactical teams. As they prepared to leave the clinic, Spirit managed to make a sound, not quite a meow, but a soft chirping noise that tiger cubs use to communicate with their mothers. The sound was so unexpected, so purely innocent, that it stopped all conversation. Eleanor reached into the transport carrier and allowed Spirit to grasp her finger with one tiny paw. "I promise you, little one, whatever happens tomorrow, you and your siblings will be safe. That's the only legacy I have left to give." Mackenzie watched the interaction and made his own silent promise. Eleanor Whitfield would not face her son's retribution alone. Whatever William Jr. had planned for his mother, he would have to go through a former Army Ranger and a war dog who understood the difference between victims and predators. As they loaded the cubs into the specially equipped transport vehicle, Ranger took one last circuit around the clinic, his nose working methodically to ensure no threats remained hidden. Only when the dog signaled all clear did Mackenzie allow himself to believe they might actually survive the night. The drive south through rural Oklahoma was conducted in convoy, Eleanor and Mary Beth with the cubs, Mackenzie and Sullivan in separate vehicles providing security. The October night was clear and cold, with stars visible between scattered clouds. It was the kind of evening that should have been peaceful, but Mackenzie's military instincts kept him scanning for threats in every shadow. Tomorrow would bring the confrontation they'd all been dreading. Tonight, they had managed to buy time and distance between the cubs and danger. Whether it would be enough remained to be seen. The abandoned Meridian oil refinery stretched across 40 acres of rusted infrastructure and forgotten dreams, its skeletal remains jutting against the Oklahoma sky like the bones of some prehistoric beast. Mackenzie had arrived before dawn with Ranger to scout the location, and what they'd found made his blood run cold. This wasn't just a meeting place, it was an active operation. 3 large shipping containers sat in the central courtyard, and the sounds coming from within spoke of living cargo. Animals, certainly, but also something that chilled Mackenzie to his core, the unmistakable sound of children crying. Through his binoculars, Mackenzie counted at least 15 men positioned around the facility, all armed, all displaying the disciplined movements of professional security. This wasn't a simple handoff. William Jr. had brought enough firepower to handle a small war. Agent Sullivan's voice crackled through his earpiece. "Detective, we've got federal tactical teams 30 minutes out, but Mrs. Whitfield is insisting we proceed with the original timeline. Her son just called, and he's threatening to execute hostages if she's late." Mackenzie's jaw tightened. They were walking into a trap, but Eleanor was right. Waiting meant certain death for whoever was locked in those containers. "Copy that. Ranger and I are in position. Tell Mrs. Whitfield we'll keep her covered." What Mackenzie hadn't told Sullivan was that Ranger had been exhibiting signs of extreme distress since they'd arrived. The dog's hackles were raised, his body trembling with the kind of fear Mackenzie had only seen once before. The day they'd discovered Ranger cowering in a bombed-out laboratory outside Fallujah, surrounded by the bodies of other military working dogs who hadn't survived whatever experiments had been conducted there. This place carried the same psychic weight of systematic cruelty that had broken Ranger's trust in humans for months after his rescue. The dog knew they were entering hell, and his canine instincts were screaming warnings that his human partner desperately wanted to heed. At 3:47 p.m., Eleanor's car approached the refinery gates. Even from a distance, Mackenzie could see her hands shaking on the steering wheel. She was driving alone, as demanded, with the 3 cubs in carriers on her back seat, or so William Jr. believed. In reality, the carriers contained sophisticated recording equipment, while the cubs remained safely at Dr. Patterson's facility 40 miles away. William Jr. emerged from the main building as his mother's car pulled into the courtyard, and Mackenzie got his first good look at the man who had turned his own family's legacy into an instrument of horror. At 35, William Jr. possessed the kind of cold handsomeness that belonged in corporate boardrooms or political campaigns. His tailored suit was immaculate despite the industrial setting, and he moved with the casual confidence of someone accustomed to absolute power. The reunion between mother and son was a masterclass in barely contained hostility. Even through binoculars, Mackenzie could read the tension in their body language. Eleanor's rigid posture, speaking of fear, barely held in check. William Jr.'s predatory circling suggesting a cat playing with wounded prey. "Where are they?" William Jr.'s voice carried clearly across the courtyard as he approached Eleanor's car. "In the back seat, exactly as you specified." Eleanor's voice was steady, but Mackenzie could hear the tremor underneath. "William, before we proceed, I need to know the sounds coming from those containers. Please tell me you're not—" "Not what, Mother? Not expanding the business model? Not maximizing our profit margins?" William Jr.'s laugh was devoid of warmth. "You always were too sentimental for real commerce." He opened Eleanor's back door and examined the carriers, his expression shifting from satisfaction to suspicion as he registered their weight. "These feel too light." Mackenzie's finger moved to his trigger as William Jr. opened the first carrier, revealing the recording equipment inside. The look that crossed the younger man's face was pure murder. "You treacherous old bitch," William Jr. snarled, his hand moving to the pistol beneath his jacket. "I should have put you in the ground with Father years ago." That's when Eleanor played her final card. "I wouldn't do that, son. Not if you want to live through the next 5 minutes." She held up a small device Mackenzie recognized as a dead man's switch. "This facility is wired with enough explosives to level 6 city blocks. The only thing keeping us all alive is my continued consciousness. Kill me and everyone dies, including your precious cargo and all the evidence that could put you away forever." William Jr.'s face went white as he processed the implications. His mother had just revealed that she'd spent months not just gathering evidence, but preparing for a scenario where the only way to stop him was mutual destruction. "You're bluffing," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Eleanor's smile was serene and terrible. "Try me." In that moment, Mackenzie realized they weren't just witnessing a sting operation. They were watching a mother's final act of love, expressed through the willingness to sacrifice everything to stop the monster she'd raised. Ranger whined softly beside him, sensing the electricity in the air, the moment when years of pain and betrayal were about to explode into violence that would change all their lives forever. The standoff lasted exactly 47 seconds before everything went to hell. William Jr.'s hand was still hovering over his weapon when one of his security team made the fatal mistake of trying to flank Eleanor's position. Mackenzie's sniper training kicked in, and his first shot dropped the man before he could complete his movement. The sound of gunfire shattered the tense silence, and suddenly the refinery courtyard erupted into chaos. Eleanor dove behind her car as bullets shattered the windows, still clutching the dead man's switch that kept them all alive. William Jr. screamed orders to his men while simultaneously trying to reach the shipping containers where his most valuable cargo was housed. Agent Sullivan's voice crackled through Mackenzie's earpiece, reporting that federal tactical teams were still 18 minutes out, an eternity in a firefight. Ranger, despite his fear of the place, pressed close to Mackenzie as they advanced through the industrial maze toward Eleanor's position. The dog's keen senses guided them around 2 ambush points, his low growls warning of hidden gunmen before they could open fire. Mackenzie had learned to trust Ranger's instincts absolutely, and that trust saved both their lives as they navigated the killing field the refinery had become. What Mackenzie hadn't anticipated was the sound that suddenly pierced through the gunfire, children screaming in terror from inside the containers. The sound hit him like a physical blow, transported him instantly back to Iraq, to villages where civilians had been caught in crossfire between his unit and insurgents. The memory of failing to save innocents then fueled his determination not to fail now. "Eleanor!" Mackenzie called out as he reached her position behind the bullet-riddled car. "Are you hit?" "No, but I can't hold this switch forever," she gasped, blood running down her face from glass cuts. "My hands are shaking too badly. If I drop this—" "You won't drop it," Mackenzie said firmly, taking position to cover her while scanning for threats. "Because those children in the containers need you to be strong for 18 more minutes." That's when they heard William Jr.'s voice, amplified by a bullhorn from somewhere deeper in the facility. "Mother, you have 60 seconds to surrender yourself, or I start executing the merchandise. Beginning with the youngest." Eleanor's face went gray. "He means it. He killed his own father, Detective. Children are just inventory to him." Mackenzie made a decision that went against every tactical principle he'd learned in 20 years of military and police service. "Give me the switch." "What?" "The dead man's switch. Give it to me." When Eleanor hesitated, he continued urgently. "I'm younger, steadier, and I've got backup coming. You need to get to those containers and try to calm the children before they panic themselves to death." "That's suicide. William Jr. will shoot me the moment I show myself." "Not if I'm providing cover fire." Mackenzie's gaze met hers, and she saw something in his eyes that reminded her of her late husband, the look of a man who'd found something worth dying for. "Mrs. Whitfield, those kids need someone to tell them help is coming. They need to hear a kind voice telling them they're going to be okay." Eleanor understood then that this was Mackenzie's chance at redemption, not just for the children he couldn't save in Iraq, but for his own grandchild he might never meet if he didn't survive this day. She handed him the switch, and their fingers touched briefly in the transfer of ultimate responsibility. 60 seconds, William Jr.'s voice echoed again. Eleanor rose from behind the car, her hands visible and empty, walking slowly toward the containers despite the obvious danger. Several of William Jr.'s men had clear shots, but something about her regal bearing, or perhaps their boss's desire to handle family matters personally, kept them from firing. Mackenzie provided overwatch, his rifle trained on any movement that might threaten Eleanor's approach. Ranger pressed against his leg, offering the same steady comfort he'd provided during Mackenzie's worst PTSD episodes. The dog seemed to understand that this moment would define them both. When Eleanor reached the first container, the sounds from within nearly broke her heart. Through the ventilation slits she could see children's faces, some Asian, some Latin American, all bearing the hollow-eyed look of trauma. The youngest couldn't have been more than 6 years old. "Listen to me, babies," Eleanor said softly, her voice carrying the authority of every grandmother who'd ever comforted a frightened child. "My name is Eleanor, and I'm here to take you home. You're going to be safe very soon, but I need you to be brave just a little longer." A small voice from inside the container responded in heavily accented English. "Lady, are you an angel?" Eleanor's tears came then, but her voice remained steady. "No, sweetheart. I'm just someone who should have stopped this a long time ago. But the angels are coming, and they're bringing policemen and doctors and people who will make sure you never have to be afraid like this again." From his position, Mackenzie watched William Jr. emerge from the main building, flanked by 4 armed men. The younger Whitfield's face was a mask of cold fury as he approached his mother and the containers. In his hand was a military-style assault rifle, and his body language suggested he'd moved beyond negotiation to execution mode. "Touching scene, Mother," William Jr. called out when he was 30 yards away. "But playtime is over. You've cost me millions of dollars and compromised operations across 3 continents. The board of directors is quite upset." "Board of directors?" Eleanor turned to face her son, her voice carrying contempt. You mean your fellow criminals? I mean people who understand that sentiment is a luxury we can't afford in global commerce. William Jr. raised his rifle, aiming directly at Eleanor's chest. You always were too weak for this business, Mother. Father was weak too. Weakness is a genetic flaw that needs to be corrected. Mackenzie's finger tightened on his trigger, but at this distance, with Eleanor directly in his line of fire, the shot was impossible. He needed William Jr. to move just 3 feet to the left, or for Eleanor to drop to the ground, or... Ranger made the decision for all of them. The German Shepherd broke from Mackenzie's side and charged across the open courtyard, his war-trained instincts overriding his psychological trauma. William Jr. spun toward the attacking dog, his rifle tracking, and in that moment of distraction, Eleanor threw herself sideways toward the container. Mackenzie's shot took William Jr. center mass, spinning him around but not dropping him immediately. The younger man's returning fire went wide, but one of his security team had a clear shot at Ranger, and took it. The bullet caught Ranger in the shoulder, sending the dog tumbling across the concrete. But his charge had bought Eleanor the precious seconds she needed to reach cover, and given Mackenzie the angle he needed to end the threat his son posed. William Jr. died as he had lived, without remorse, his final words a curse directed at his mother for ruining everything. In the sudden silence that followed, broken only by approaching sirens and the continued weeping from the containers, Mackenzie crawled to where Ranger lay bleeding on the concrete. The dog's eyes were open, his tail attempting a weak wag when he saw his partner's face. "Good boy," Mackenzie whispered, applying pressure to the wound while tears he hadn't shed since Iraq ran down his weathered cheeks. "You're such a good boy, Ranger. You saved them all." But as federal agents swarmed the facility and paramedics rushed toward them, Mackenzie could see in Ranger's eyes what the dog was trying to tell him, that some prices are worth paying and some loves are worth dying for. 1 year later, the morning sun filtered through the oak trees at Eleanor's Hope Sanctuary, casting dappled shadows across the rolling hills of eastern Oklahoma. Detective Billy Mackenzie, now permanently retired and serving as the sanctuary's director, stood at the edge of the tiger enclosure watching honor and courage play in their spacious habitat. The 2 cubs had grown into magnificent young adults, their coats lustrous and thick, their movements powerful and graceful as nature intended. Spirit, though still smaller than his siblings, had become the undisputed leader of their small pride. His near-death experience seemed to have instilled in him a fierce protectiveness that extended not just to honor and courage, but to every creature within the sanctuary's boundaries. Dr. Mary Beth Mackenzie, she'd taken Billy's name when they married 6 months ago, often marveled at the little tiger's intuitive understanding of which animals needed comfort and which needed space to heal. The sanctuary now housed 147 rescued animals, from the 3 Bengal tigers who'd started it all to a family of spider monkeys recovered from a roadside zoo in Arkansas. Each animal had its own story of survival, its own journey from exploitation to safety, and Billy knew them all by name. At 59, he'd found the purpose that had eluded him for decades, not just in law enforcement or military service, but in creating a place where broken creatures could heal. Ranger dozed in his favorite spot beside the tiger enclosure, his graying muzzle resting on his paws as he supervised the morning routine. The bullet wound to his shoulder had healed cleanly, though it left him with a slight limp that only became noticeable when storms approached. The psychological wounds from that day at the refinery had taken longer to heal, but the presence of so many rescued animals seemed to give the old dog a sense of continuing purpose. At 9 years old, Ranger had earned the right to be a beloved grandfather figure rather than a working dog, though his protective instincts remained as sharp as ever. The sound of children's laughter drew Billy's attention to the education center, where Mary Beth was conducting the morning tour for a group of local elementary students. Among them was 5-year-old Tommy Sullivan, Sarah's son and Billy's grandson, who visited the sanctuary every weekend and had declared his intention to become a tiger doctor when he grew up. Billy's relationship with his daughter Sarah had transformed completely in the year since the refinery incident. The grandfather she'd hesitantly reached out to had been replaced by a man who'd found peace with his past and purpose in his present. Sarah was 8 months pregnant now with her second child, and she'd asked Billy to be in the delivery room, a request that still brought tears to his eyes when he thought about it. The sanctuary's success had attracted national attention, not just for its rescue work, but for the story behind its founding. Eleanor's hope had become a symbol of how individual courage could triumph over systematic evil, and donations poured in from across the country. Several major conservation organizations had offered partnerships, and there was talk of expanding to include a breeding program for endangered species. But for Billy, the true measure of success came in quieter moments, like watching Spirit gently nuzzle a newly arrived bear cub who'd been traumatized by years in a roadside attraction, or seeing Ranger patiently allow visiting children to pet his graying fur while he supervised their tour of the facilities. The investigation that had begun with 3 dying cubs in a suitcase had ultimately led to the dismantling of one of the largest wildlife and human trafficking networks in North American history. 47 arrests across 12 countries had resulted in the rescue of over 800 animals and 237 children. Agent Rebecca Sullivan, promoted to head the FBI's Wildlife Trafficking Task Force, visited the sanctuary quarterly to brief Billy on the ongoing prosecutions and to spend time with her sister, Maria, who now worked as the sanctuary's counselor for visiting survivors of trafficking. Eleanor's legacy lived on, not just in the sanctuary that bore her name, but in the foundation she'd established with her final will and testament. The Whitfield Conservation Foundation had been completely restructured, its mission refocused on legitimate wildlife protection and survivor support. The $3.2 million Eleanor had left specifically for the sanctuary's operation ensured that no animal would ever be turned away due to financial constraints. A memorial garden near the sanctuary's entrance honored Eleanor's sacrifice, its centerpiece a simple granite bench overlooking the tiger habitat. Billy visited there every morning, updating Eleanor on the sanctuary's progress and the lives she'd saved through her courage. Sometimes Spirit would join him, the young tiger sitting quietly beside the bench as if he understood the significance of the spot. The legal proceedings had been lengthy but ultimately satisfying. William Jr.'s network had been thoroughly exposed, with financial forensics revealing the scope of his international operations. 7 co-conspirators had received life sentences, and the survivors, both human and animal, had been provided with comprehensive care and rehabilitation. Several of the rescued children had been reunited with families they'd been stolen from years earlier, while others had been placed in loving adoptive homes. Mary Beth approached from the education center, her veterinary bag in one hand and a smile that still made Billy's heart skip beats in the other. At 53, she'd found not just love, but a partnership that combined her professional skills with her deepest values. The sanctuary's medical facility was now considered one of the premier exotic animal care centers in the region, and veterinary students from across the country came to train under her guidance. The new arrivals from the Florida seizure should be here this afternoon, she reported, settling beside Billy on the observation deck. 3 more tigers, 2 leopards, and a family of lemurs. Fish and Wildlife says the tigers are in better shape than usual, but the lemurs will need extensive rehabilitation. Billy nodded, already mentally organizing space and resources for the newcomers. Each arrival brought its own challenges and rewards, its own story of survival that added to the sanctuary's growing legacy. As if sensing their conversation, Spirit raised his magnificent head and looked directly at Billy, those amber eyes that had once been clouded with pain, now bright with intelligence and contentment. The young tiger's soft chuff seemed to say what Billy felt every morning when he woke up in this place Eleanor's sacrifice had made possible, that sometimes the worst tragedies could give birth to the most beautiful redemptions. Tommy's voice carried across the grounds as he spotted his grandfather. "Papa Billy, can we feed the tigers today? Can Ranger come too?" Billy grinned, feeling the truth of Eleanor's final lesson settle in his heart once more. Family wasn't just about blood relationships. It was about choosing to show up for each other, day after day, regardless of past mistakes or future uncertainties. It was about creating spaces where love could grow and healing could happen, where broken creatures, human and animal alike, could find their way back to trust and joy. Standing to join his grandson and the tour group, Billy paused for one last look at the memorial garden. "Thank you, Eleanor," he whispered, "for showing us that it's never too late to choose love over fear." Ranger woofed softly in agreement, his tail wagging as he prepared to greet another day of visitors eager to learn about the power of second chances. At 58, Billy Mackenzie thought his best years were behind him, haunted by war, broken by divorce, estranged from his children, facing retirement with nothing but regrets and an aging dog for company. Sound familiar? How many of us have stood at that crossroads, wondering if we've missed our chance at meaningful purpose? Billy's story reminds us that sometimes life's most profound chapters begin when we think the book is ending. When he found those 3 dying tiger cubs in a suitcase, he didn't just save their lives, he discovered that his own life still had extraordinary purpose. At an age when society tells us to slow down, Billy built a sanctuary that became a beacon of hope for hundreds of rescued animals and trafficking survivors. He reconciled with his daughter, became the grandfather he'd always wanted to be, found love again with Mary Beth, and created a legacy that will outlast him by generations. Your wisdom, your experience, your compassion, these aren't diminished by age, they're refined by it. Like Billy, you have everything needed to make your next chapter your most meaningful one. What dream have you set aside that might still be waiting for you? What difference could you make if you believed it's never too late to start again? Questions for you. What's one dream you've put on hold that still calls to your heart? If you could start a sanctuary for something you care deeply about, what would it be? Share your thoughts below. Your story might inspire someone else to take that first brave step toward their own second chapter.